Our next conversation is in partnership with EarthX. EarthX is also a programming partner that is interacting with us at the annual summit, the Africa Initiative now, and the Americas Summit in 2 weeks. And I do encourage you, if you're not familiar with EarthX, to check out their page on our sponsors and partners page so that you can see more about EarthX TV. There's some amazing content that they are putting out there. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I very much encourage you to do so. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome our moderator for this discussion, Matt Boguslawski, Director of Conservation for EarthX, and our esteemed panel. Matt, over to you.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I'm Matt Boguslawski, Director of Conservation at EarthX. Thank you for joining us today during Concordia's Africa Initiative. Today, we'll be discussing an important topic, preventing future pandemics and the state of African conservation. I'm proud to introduce today's expert group of panelists. Joining us are Catherine Semcer, Research Fellow at the Property Environment Research Center, Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown, Senior Fellow in the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Brookings Institute, and Dr. Jonathan Epstein, Vice President for Science and Outreach at EcoHealth Alliance. Dr. Epstein is a veterinarian and disease ecologist. Thank you all for your participation today. I believe this expert panel will challenge our concepts surrounding these important topics. Any comments from our panelists before we get going? All good? All right, well, let's get started. Jonathan, leading off with you. What do we know about zoonotic diseases originating in Africa? What are the drivers and risks that we're seeing?
Well, thank you, Matt. And first of all, let me thank Concordia for hosting this important discussion. It's a pleasure to be here with Catherine and Vanda again, and yourself. The question of what we know about African zoonoses is really tied into what we know about zoonoses globally. We're starting to have a really good understanding that there are certain parts of the world, both in Africa and in Asia and in the Americas, that are particularly vulnerable to the emergence of new diseases that originate in animal reservoirs. And the majority of emerging diseases start in wildlife, different species of wildlife that may carry viruses or bacteria that have the ability to infect domestic animals like cattle, goats, poultry, and spread into people. There are examples of these all over the place. But the important thing is that what makes an area, a region of the world vulnerable to emerging diseases has a lot to do with dynamic activities that people do that change the environment around us and bring us and our livestock into closer contact with wildlife. So things like deforestation, land use change, agricultural expansion and intensification as we grow our livestock enterprises and move them closer to pristine and forested areas where wildlife and livestock have opportunities to make contact, or where people and wildlife do. Similarly, bushmeat hunting and wildlife trade together influence the way we contact wildlife. So geographically, there are parts of the world where human demography, human population is intensively interacting with animals, and that creates risk for pathogens like viruses to jump from their natural animal hosts into new hosts like domestic animals or people. So Africa, like other parts of the world, has areas where this is happening very dynamically. Parts of East Africa, Central, West Africa, where there's still forested area with high biodiversity, but a lot of human and animal interaction as things are changing, as landscapes are changing due to human activities. So that's the first point, is the majority of outbreaks we see that are zoonotic in nature, that originate in wildlife, really come from human activities, pressures that we're putting on natural environments and ecosystems that influence our contact with animals and allows for pathogens to emerge. And there are some really important examples that have come from Africa, and perhaps the most important zoonotic virus to emerge out of the African continent is HIV. Originally in non-human primates, chimpanzees specifically, this is a virus that made the jump into people through hunting activities, butchering and handling wildlife. The process of getting exposed to blood and bodily fluids allowed a non-human primate virus, simian immunodeficiency virus, to make the jump into people and adapt to human hosts and eventually just spread person to person globally and become HIV. So that one has, become a global pandemic and has been responsible for the death of more than 40 million people globally. There are other zoonoses too, and probably the ones that are most salient are Ebola virus. And we've known about Ebola since the mid-70s, and we've experienced probably about 35 different outbreaks, but it's still really difficult to understand the ecology of this virus. The majority of scientific evidence points to bats, different species of bats, as potential reservoirs for Ebola and related viruses. And there have been some really good studies showing that bats do carry these groups of viruses. But exactly how they make their way from bats into people is very contextual. There have been some outbreaks in Central Africa in the early 2000s that had to do with bushmeat hunting, where people were gathering carcasses of great apes, gorillas, and chimpanzees that had died from Ebola. And as we know, a body, like the human body, remains infectious for days after death. And that was true for great apes too. So contact with dead animals that had died from Ebola and that were still full of virus allowed for human infection in villages and for Ebola outbreaks to start. And then, of course, in 2014 was the biggest Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which also began with a young boy's contact with wildlife, presumed to be a bat, but we don't know for sure. This was in Gecko in Guinea, and then it spread person to person to 3 different countries, and led to the infection of more than 20,000 people in 3 major metropolitan cities, capital cities in 3 countries. Absolutely devastating outbreak. And there have been the emergence of other viruses, influenza viruses like H5N1, which go through wild migratory birds into poultry and then people. And of course, Middle East respiratory syndrome, a coronavirus related to SARS-CoV-2 and the pandemic we're experiencing now. But this is a virus that originated in bats and emerged in dromedary camels and now circulates widely in dromedary camels. And although most of the cases have occurred in the Middle East, on the Arabian Peninsula, we know that there's a robust trade in dromedary camels from Northern Africa into the Middle East. And that's all part of the process of how pathogens like MERS have moved into an area where people get exposed from contact with camels, and it causes outbreaks. And MERS carries a fatality rate of 35%, so it's a significant zoonosis. Now, the point is, as we learn more and more about the variety, the diversity of viruses carried by different wildlife species, we'll start to have a better understanding in an African context of how people are vulnerable to emergence. And last thing I'll say is that there are serious investments and activities underway to work with partners in African countries to strengthen infrastructure, strengthen our ability to recognize new emerging zoonoses as they occur, and our ability to contain them so that they don't become widespread global pandemics. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Catherine, moving on to you, what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on African conservation efforts?
Well, the impact on conservation efforts has been very troubling. And I think if there's one key and obvious takeaway from the pandemic is that we really need to start approaching conservation differently, not just in Africa, but around the world. You know, in Africa, the dominant conservation model is the colonial model, the one based on establishing protected areas based on their aesthetic or recreational value. And I think we really need to start moving towards an independence-oriented model that views conservation as a vehicle to deliver prosperity, stability, and security. Now, what we've seen happen in the course of this pandemic, because conservation was so heavily dependent on tourism revenue, is a great deal of suffering. Protected areas are unable to be funded because the tourists did not come this year. This has had dramatic impacts in places like Tanzania on the ability to field anti-poaching forces, which of course is key in disrupting the supply chains of trafficked wildlife, which can transmit disease. Similarly, we've seen huge impacts on the local communities that depend on tourism revenues. We're getting reports of increased poaching within protected areas, again, bringing people into contact with the bushmeat that can transmit diseases. Some of the numbers that are out there, I've heard that, better than 90% of the tourism operators in Africa have seen a 75% or greater decline in their tourism bookings. So the scale of this is massive. And a lot of the operators that I've spoken to have been taking out loans, selling off assets, cutting costs, and this is just obviously not sustainable. So what we really need to do is move not completely away, but partially away from this tourism-based model and start looking at other justifications for conservation, particularly the role of ecosystem services, of which pandemic prevention is one. And we obviously have a new administration coming into the White House right now, come January, and I think there's a couple opportunities in front of them to help facilitate this transition. The first is, we have to look at the debt load that African nations are currently carrying, and start thinking about, can we negotiate binding, transparent, long-term debt for nature swaps, prioritizing the areas of high biodiversity that have a high overlap of emerging zoonotic diseases. Is that something the United States can do? And moreover, China has been trying to show that it has bona fide environmental concerns. Well, they're carrying between 17 and 25% of the continent's debt load. They should be looking at negotiating debt for nature swaps as well. But beyond that, if we look at institutions like the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, we just heard from the acting USAID administrator, how can we bring U.S. investment dollars to the continent for things like carbon sequestration, for water funds, like those that are currently in place, around Cape Town and Nairobi. And how can we integrate conservation into things like the Corporate Council on Africa, into the U.S. Africa Business Summits, into the World Economic Forum, so that we're having a more sophisticated conversation, and it's not just about going out in a Land Rover, looking at the sunset and appreciating a zebra, but actually helping the continent, recover from this pandemic and building back better.
Thank you, Catherine. And one other thing in terms of Conservation Africa, it's heavily NGO funded from a wide scale, and with the pandemic and the economic implications that it's had, I can imagine that donor funding just in general has been cut down significantly. I saw a statistic the other day that I think 50% of small-based UK nonprofits are set to fold. So I imagine that's just an exacerbating factor that we're dealing with.
Absolutely. And again, it gets to moving, broadening the base of support for conservation, beyond tourism, beyond NGO funding, and actually integrating it into the business community. I always say conservation is the business that enables every other business. And we need to start making that the paradigm than what we've done historically.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Catherine. Vanda, swapping over to you. From a policy perspective, what can we do to combat future zoonotic pandemics in Africa? Are sweeping trade and market bans the answer?
No, there is a role for bans. I mean, we have to recognize what the crucial points of transmission are. And both John and Catherine had highlighted several. One source of transmission, of course, is trade, whether it's legal trade in live wildlife or whether it's illegal trade. And in fact, I would emphasize that even in the legal trade, the monitoring for zoonotic diseases is extraordinarily poor. And that's hardly solely the case in places like Africa, or for that matter, Latin America, where I would point out the chance of zoonosis is very high and the level of preparedness, awareness, focus is even far lesser than in Africa. But it's also of destruction of habitat, whether it's destruction of habitat for resources or for land, for farming, for soybean production, for timber, agricultural, the way we do agriculture. There are two broad sets of vectors of transmission. One is live trade in animals, whether legal or illegal, wildlife market that are poorly monitored, unhygienic. And the second is destruction of habitats, particularly the habitats with high biodiversity that push animals very close together, facilitate transmission of disease among animals, and then with human presence or the presence of livestock, jump to humans. And the third and related to the previous one is food production, even food production of farms, whether it's simply livestock, animals that have been domesticated, or farms that mix wild animals with domesticated animals. All of these are three big buckets of transmission chances, all need to be tackled. But how one tackles one has impact on the other. For example, if we were to ban all trade in wildlife, that would likely exacerbate the already very intense destruction of habitat that might be exactly counterproductive by depriving communities and governments of revenues from protected habitats. and that would perhaps reduce one source of transmission, but would amplify another source of transmission. So the difficulty for policy is really reaching the sweet spot of building enough economic incentives to reduce chance of one form of dangerous transmission, wildlife trade in live animals, wildlife markets, wildlife meat, while preserving habitats as much as possible. And I would like to add to what Catherine was saying, the absolute crucial importance of thinking about funding biodiversity beyond ecotourism is indeed where policy needs to go. But the reality is that in the immediate reaction to the pandemic, many governments, not just in Africa, but also in Africa, in Brazil and Indonesia, are in fact reacting by allowing far greater exploitation of natural resources. Indonesia passed an omnibus law weakening 72 different regulations, 75 regulations, environmental regulations to facilitate logging. And this so right after receiving almost $100 million payments for a REDD++, for preservation of rainforest, so payment for ecosystems, and yet immediately passed this very disastrous bill. So there is a real urgency in stopping immediate destruction, which is a way that governments are seeking to compensate for the shrinkage of revenue and shrinkage of GDP, while giving a chance for payments for ecosystem services and other biodiversity funding to develop. And so there are these two very different timelines. We know that setting up payments for ecosystem services is hard. It has not been a roaring success, whether it's REDD++ or whether it's other funding mechanisms that have emerged, been even in places like the United States. And government regulation is critical. The markets will not develop sufficient demand for nature credits, for swaps, if there is not strong domestic regulation, whether it's in places like the United States with great opportunities, with Build Back Better, or places like India and China, where there in fact is very little interest so far in participating in such efforts.
Excellent, thank you. So kind of open to the panel here. What do we have any examples from the African continent where bans related to wildlife trade have actually had negative implications from a zoonotic transmission standpoint or exacerbating these risks?
Well, I don't know if outright bans have been linked, but what has been interesting is that when there's been messaging around the avoidance of wildlife hunting, particularly during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, where wildlife is a central part of the diet, an important source of protein, and bats, which are the presumed reservoir for Ebola, are hunted and eaten, there were messages from public health agencies for people to avoid eating bushmeat during the Ebola epidemic. And it was so, the epidemic was so impactful, so powerful, and really shocking that people did adhere to it. But what was interesting was that, this deprives people, first of all, of an important source of protein. But secondly, there were calls coming into the Ministry of Health, at least in Liberia, where I was working, of people asking when they could go back to eating bats and wildlife. And so even if you temporarily suspend activities for a public health reason, it's really a strong part of culture and society in many parts of Africa and indeed the world that depend on wildlife. And so it shows that outright bans are not going to be effective just simply because people depend on wildlife in so many ways, but rather we have to have a smarter approach to trying to reduce risk when it comes to environmental change and contact with wildlife, so that there are alternatives for people to support themselves and their family nutritionally and economically, while also reducing the risk of exposure to zoonoses.
Yes, sir. And I would imagine these calls for less reliance, in fact, can drive the market underground, where there's less regulation, less monitoring, and more, and again, kind of exacerbating the potential for an outbreak of sorts.
Well, Matt, if I can come in here, that's an important issue, but it's an issue that is as complex as the debate. It is equally too simplistic to say that if a market goes underground, the danger is greater. So we need to distinguish where the market goes underground and how. For example, imagine that the market goes underground in West Africa and the amount of customers, buyers buying the wildlife meat is the same as before and monitoring is poorer. That would be a worse outcome than if you have access to monitoring. On the other hand, imagine a wildlife market in China where now consumption of wildlife meat is banned, and where wildlife markets or throughout Southeast Asia are major sources of zoonotic risk. And you ban those markets, and now instead you have a trade in an underground, literally underground facility with many fewer customers. You have created great barriers to access. So you have many fewer customers. The level of monitoring is the same as the legal markets are not monitored. You have probably significantly reduced through even an underground market the chance of zoonosis. And then if you move to trade online, again, you are reducing, you are raising barriers to access and reducing the amount of people that come in contact. So I am far more comfortable having the result of a ban on wildlife meat consumption in China go online and be hidden online. The risk of transmission there have gone down. You have still ended up with a better risk reduction situation than you had in a prior unmitigated situation. I think the West African markets are a special case where at this point, having the market go underground without monitoring would be a worse outcome. And then you have a third setting, which is where demand is emerging. Markets and commercializations create new customers. We want to avoid that. So you have a set of populations that are forest dependent. Their access to protein is driven by access to animals, and obviously the protein needs to be preserved. But that doesn't mean that you want to be encouraging a big wild explosion in new demand for people who live in cities, such as in major African cities, or for that matter, in Latin America, where you are seeing the development of taste for wild meat. We don't want to encourage that for many reasons, zoonotic transmission being one. There are other conservation reasons. And in this case, if markets are not established and there is not robust pre-existing demand, I am totally fine in not allowing legal markets to emerge, perhaps with some very special exceptions and situations. So even in this conversation, one needs to distinguish a particular market and decide whether ban is appropriate or not, rather than say yes or no in very blanket terms.
Well, thank you very much for that, Vanda, and thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Concordia for hosting us. That was an excellent experience.